Mother Bear was falling from the cliff. This group of human babies did something shocking to save her. Let us know where you're watching from. The afternoon sun painted golden streaks across the rugged mountain range. Towering cliffs stood sentinel over a dense forest below, where pine trees swayed gently in the breeze. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of rushing water from a nearby stream. In a small clearing not far from a family campsite, 5 toddlers played together, their innocent laughter filling the air. Little Emma, barely 2 years old with bouncing blonde curls, stacked small pebbles into wobbly towers. Next to her, Aiden, with his curious brown eyes and chubby fingers, was fascinated by a colorful leaf he had found. The twins, Zoe and Noah, still unsteady on their feet, waddled around chasing butterflies, while baby Mia sat contentedly, babbling to herself as she patted the soft earth beneath her tiny palms. The children's parents had stepped away momentarily to prepare lunch at their campsite just beyond the tree line. They could still hear the happy sounds of their children playing, reassuring them that everything was fine. The clearing was safe, flat, and free from danger, or so they thought. Without warning, a deep, panicked growl shattered the peaceful scene. The sound was so primal and filled with fear that even the babies, too young to understand words, froze in place. Their wide eyes turned toward the source of the sound. There, not 30 feet away, clinging desperately to the edge of a steep cliff, was an enormous mother bear. Her massive paws scraped frantically against loose rock and dirt, sending small cascades of pebbles tumbling into the abyss below. The ground beneath her was crumbling, unable to support her weight as she struggled to pull herself up. With each movement, more of the cliff edge broke away, bringing her closer to a fatal drop. Above her, a small bear cub paced anxiously, releasing high-pitched wails that pierced the air. The tiny creature moved back and forth along the edge, occasionally peering down at its mother with evident distress, but helpless to do anything more. How had the mother bear found herself in such a precarious position? Perhaps she had been reaching for a honeycomb nestled in the cliff face, or maybe she had been trying to create a safer path for her cub to descend. Whatever the reason, she was now moments away from plummeting to the rocky ground far below. The toddlers remained still, their playful activities forgotten as they watched the unfolding drama. Fear should have sent them crying for their parents, but instead, a strange calm seemed to settle over the group. Emma tilted her head, her young mind trying to process what she was seeing. Aiden's mouth formed a small O of surprise. The twins stepped closer to each other, instinctively seeking comfort, while baby Mia's babbling quieted to a curious hum. In that moment, as the mother bear released another desperate roar and her claws scraped uselessly against the crumbling rock, no one could have predicted what would happen next. No one could have imagined that these tiny humans, barely able to form words, would be the only hope for the mighty creature hanging between life and death. The children looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them that defied their young age. And then, as if guided by some ancient instinct deeper than language itself, they began to move toward the cliff edge. What could a group of toddlers possibly do to save a creature weighing hundreds of pounds? What desperate measures would these innocent children take? And would help arrive in time, or would these tiny humans have to rely solely on their own mysterious plan? The mother bear's grip was weakening by the second, and time was running out. The mother bear let out another desperate roar, this one filled with such raw fear that it seemed to vibrate through the earth beneath the toddler's feet. Her massive body trembled with exhaustion, muscles straining visibly beneath her thick brown fur. One of her back paws slipped, sending a shower of rocks tumbling down the cliff face. She now hung by just 3 paws, her weight causing more of the edge to crack and break away. Emma was the first to move. Though she couldn't form complete sentences yet, she pointed toward the struggling bear and made urgent sounds to her playmates. "Bah! Bah!" she exclaimed, her tiny finger trembling as she directed their attention. Aiden nodded solemnly, as if understanding perfectly what she meant. He dropped his precious leaf and began to toddle forward with determined little steps. The twins, Zoe and Noah, watched Emma and Aiden with wide eyes before exchanging a glance. Then, as if receiving silent instructions, they too began to move forward. Even baby Mia, the youngest of the group at just 14 months old, crawled with surprising speed toward her friends. Away at the campsite, the parents were laying out sandwiches on a picnic blanket, completely unaware of the crisis unfolding just beyond their sight. The dense cluster of trees between them and the clearing muffled the sounds of the bear's distress. Jake, Emma's father, paused for a moment, thinking he heard something unusual. But when Sarah, Aiden's mother, asked him a question about the trail map, he turned his attention back to the conversation. Back at the cliff edge, the bear cub's cries grew more frantic. It paced back and forth, occasionally pawing at the ground near where its mother hung. A small avalanche of dirt and pebbles rained down on the mother bear's face, causing her to growl in frustration. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision while maintaining her precarious hold. The toddlers had now formed a small cluster about 10 feet from the cliff edge. Emma, seemingly taking charge despite her young age, made a series of gestures and baby sounds that somehow communicated a plan to the others. Aiden nodded vigorously and began looking around the clearing. His eyes lit up when he spotted a long, sturdy branch that had fallen from one of the nearby trees. With determination that belied his small size, Aiden wrapped his chubby fingers around the branch and began dragging it toward the cliff. It was far too heavy for him to lift, but he managed to pull it inch by inch across the ground. Seeing his struggle, Zoe and Noah toddled over to help, adding their tiny strength to the effort. Together, the three of them managed to drag the branch closer to where Emma waited. Meanwhile, Emma had discovered a patch of wild berries growing near the cliff edge. With careful fingers, she began picking the bright red berries, filling the front of her little overalls with the juicy fruits. Her focused expression suggested a plan was forming in her young mind. Baby Mia had crawled to a small puddle left by the morning rain. She splashed her hands in the water, giggling at first, but then began scooping mud from the edges and packing it into a wobbly ball. Though she couldn't possibly understand the gravity of the situation, something in the collective energy of her playmates had inspired her to action. The mother bear's situation was growing more dire by the second. Her weight had caused a significant crack to form along the cliff edge, and it was beginning to separate from the main structure. The bear could sense what was happening. Her eyes widened with the realization that she was about to fall. She made one last desperate attempt to pull herself up, her powerful muscles straining, but the rock crumbled further under her paws. That's when something completely unexpected happened. A small, smooth stone sailed through the air and landed near the bear cub. Then another. The startled cub stepped back from the edge, momentarily distracted from its mother's plight. It was Emma. She had abandoned her berry collection and was now throwing small stones toward the cub, not to hit it, but to draw it away from the unstable edge. With each stone she threw, she made soft cooing sounds, as if trying to communicate with the frightened animal. Suddenly, a low, rumbling sound came from deep within the earth. The ground trembled slightly, causing both the toddlers and the bears to freeze in place. A forest ranger, Monica Chen, who had been tracking the bear and her cub for a wildlife study, felt it too from her position 1/2 mile away. She immediately recognized the warning signs of a potential landslide and quickened her pace toward the GPS coordinates where she had last tracked the mother bear. The rumbling subsided, but the brief tremor had further weakened the cliff edge. Large cracks were now visible along the surface, spiderwebbing outward from where the mother bear hung. The cub, momentarily distracted by Emma's stones, returned to the edge and peered down at its mother with renewed panic. Below, Aiden, Zoe, and Noah had positioned the branch as close to the cliff edge as they dared to go. The branch was long enough that it extended several feet over the edge, pointing downward like a primitive rescue pole, but it was still several feet away from where the mother bear clung to the crumbling rock. That's when Mia did something that left even the other toddlers staring in amazement. She had crawled to the edge of the cliff, mud balls still clutched in her tiny hand. Without hesitation, she reached out and began patting the mud onto the ground near where the bear's paws gripped the edge. Her innocent mind had somehow grasped that the crumbling earth was part of the problem, and in her own baby way, she was trying to pack it down to make it more stable. The mother bear's eyes locked with Mia's for a brief, surreal moment. A massive wild predator and a human baby, separated by just a few feet, one hanging on for dear life, the other trying to help in the only way she knew how. Then, from the forest behind them, came a new sound, the sharp bark of a dog. A large German shepherd burst from the trees, followed closely by Ranger Chen. The ranger stopped abruptly at the edge of the clearing, her experienced eyes taking in the incredible scene before her. 4 toddlers by the cliff edge, a massive branch positioned precariously, a baby actually at the very edge patting mud, and a mother bear hanging for her life while her cub paced nervously above. "Stay completely still, children," Monica called out, keeping her voice calm despite her alarm. She slowly reached for her radio to call for backup, but before she could press the button, the earth beneath the mother bear gave way completely. The massive animal let out a final roar as she began to fall. Time seemed to slow down as gravity took hold. The cub wailed. The toddlers froze. Ranger Chen and her dog rushed forward. But in that split second, something extraordinary happened. Emma, who had been collecting berries, threw the entire contents of her overalls over the cliff edge. The bright red berries scattered through the air, falling past the mother bear. The bear's instinct took over, and one massive paw swiped at the falling food, momentarily distracting her from her fall. In that same instant, Aiden, Zoe, and Noah gave the branch a final push. It slid forward and downward, its end coming to rest against a small outcropping of rock that had previously been hidden from view. The branch created a makeshift ramp that brushed against the bear's back. Whether by incredible luck, divine intervention, or some inexplicable connection between the children and the bears, the mother bear's falling body made contact with the branch. Her instincts kicked in and her powerful claws latched onto the wood. The branch bent dangerously under her weight but didn't break. It created just enough of a pause in her fall, just enough of a change in her trajectory, that she was able to reach out with her other paw and grab onto a sturdier section of the cliff face that had been just out of reach before. Ranger Chen had reached Mia and scooped the baby up from the dangerous edge, but she paused in amazement when she saw what was happening. The mother bear, using the branch as a momentary support and pivot point, had managed to swing herself toward a more stable part of the cliff. With renewed strength born of desperation, she dug her claws into solid rock and began to climb. Above, the cub sensed the change in fortune and began making excited noises, bouncing up and down as it watched its mother slowly but surely making her way up the cliff face. The bear's powerful muscles strained with each movement, but she was no longer in immediate danger of falling. The toddlers watched in wide-eyed wonder, seemingly unaware of how close they had come to disaster themselves. Emma clapped her hands in delight, Aiden beamed with pride. The twins hugged each other, and Mia, now safe in Ranger Chen's arms, giggled and pointed at the climbing bear. Just then, the parents burst into the clearing, having finally heard the commotion. Their faces registered shock, fear, and confusion as they took in the scene. Their children near a cliff edge, a park ranger holding Mia, a massive branch extending over the cliff, and a huge bear climbing up the rock face while a cub danced excitedly above. "What in the world?" Jake began, but he was interrupted by a triumphant roar as the mother bear finally pulled herself onto solid ground at the top of the cliff. She immediately gathered her cub close, nuzzling it protectively while keeping a wary eye on the humans below. The parents rushed forward to collect their children, checking them frantically for any injuries. Ranger Chen quickly explained what she had witnessed, though even she could hardly believe what had just happened. "I've been tracking this bear and her cub for our wildlife study," Monica explained, still holding Mia, who was contentedly playing with the ranger's badge. "They're part of a vulnerable population in these mountains. When I felt the tremor, I was worried they might be in danger from a landslide. I never expected—" Her voice trailed off as she looked at the toddlers with a mixture of amazement and professional concern. "Are you telling me our babies somehow helped save that bear?" Sarah asked incredulously, clutching Aiden to her chest. The little boy squirmed, reaching his arms out toward the cliff as if he wasn't finished with his rescue mission. "I know it sounds impossible," Monica replied, "but yes, that's exactly what I saw. They worked together in a way that—" She shook her head, still processing the event. "In my 15 years as a wildlife ranger, I've never seen anything like it." The mother bear stood protectively over her cub, watching the humans with cautious eyes. Instead of immediately retreating into the forest as would be expected, she remained still, her gaze moving from one toddler to another. There was something in her expression, something that made the adults fall silent in wonder. Emma broke free from her father's grasp and took 2 wobbly steps forward. Before Jake could lunge to grab her, the little girl stopped and raised her small hand in a wave. "Bye-bye, buh," she said clearly, perhaps her first attempt at a full word. To everyone's astonishment, the mother bear dipped her massive head once, in what could only be described as a nod of acknowledgement. Then, with gentle nudges, she guided her cub away from the cliff edge and into the shelter of the forest. The last they saw was the swaying of branches as the 2 bears disappeared into the green shadows. A heavy silence fell over the clearing, broken only by Mia's contented babbling. The parents looked at each other, then at their children, trying to comprehend what had just happened. "We should get everyone back to camp," Monica finally said, handing Mia to her mother. "That tremor concerns me. It could be a sign of unstable ground in this area." As they gathered the children and prepared to leave, Monica paused to examine the cliff edge where the drama had unfolded. Her trained eye noticed something the others had missed, a narrow crevice in the rock face, partially obscured by vegetation. Leaning closer, but keeping a safe distance from the edge, she could make out the distinctive hexagonal patterns of a honeycomb nestled deep within the crevice. Mystery solved. The mother bear had likely been trying to reach the honey when the unstable ground gave way. But that scientific explanation did nothing to account for what had happened afterward. The extraordinary interaction between the wild bears and the human babies, the seemingly impossible timing of events that had saved the mother bear from a deadly fall. Back at the campsite, as the parents packed up their gear, deciding unanimously to cut their camping trip short after such an eventful morning, the toddlers sat together on a blanket, apparently engaging in their own form of communication. Emma pointed to the forest and made a growling sound. Aiden nodded vigorously. The twins giggled and mimicked throwing motions, while Mia patted the ground just as she had done with her mud ball at the cliff edge. Were they simply playing, mimicking what they had experienced, or were they somehow recounting their adventure to each other in their own pre-verbal language? The parents watched with new eyes, suddenly wondering how much their babies understood about the world around them, and how much the adults themselves still had to learn. As they drove away from the campsite, Monica Chen remained behind, completing her field notes for the day. How could she possibly document what she had witnessed? What would her colleagues at the wildlife department say? She decided to stick to the observable facts. The mother bear and her cub were safe, having narrowly escaped a dangerous situation caused by unstable ground near the cliff edge. The rest, the inexplicable cooperation of 5 toddlers, the almost supernatural timing of their actions, she kept to herself, filing it away as one of those mysteries of nature that science had yet to explain. Later that evening, as each family settled back into the safety of their homes, something remarkable happened in 5 different houses, miles apart from each other. Emma, Aiden, Zoe, Noah, and Mia all slept with their arms outstretched, their tiny hands opening and closing as if reaching for something, or someone, beyond their dreams. And in their separate homes, each child murmured the same sound in their sleep, a soft, gentle growl. Miles away, deep in the forest, the mother bear curled protectively around her cub in their den. As moonlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor, the bear's ears twitched at every sound, alert, protective, alive. Her cub snuggled closer, making soft snuffling noises in its sleep. The mother bear's eyes remained open for a long time, gazing into the darkness, remembering the small creatures whose actions had defied all natural laws and expectations. 2 worlds had collided that day, the wild and the civilized, the animal and the human, instinct and innocence. In that collision, something magical had happened, something that transcended the boundaries that usually kept these worlds apart. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful connections are forged in moments of crisis, and that compassion can exist without language, wisdom without words, and heroism without sighs. The forest grew quiet as night deepened. In 5 different nurseries and 1 mountain den, the unlikely heroes of the day finally slept, tiny bodies at rest after their extraordinary adventure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries. But for tonight, they shared a bond that no one else could fully understand, a secret language of courage, kindness, and connection that needed no translation. And high on the cliff where it all happened, the branch that had served as an impromptu bridge remained, a testament to the moment when the impossible became possible through the innocent actions of the very young. Nearby, wild berries had taken root in the mud that baby Mia had packed around the cliff edge, creating a splash of vibrant color against the gray rock. Life continuing, growing, flourishing, just as it had been saved that remarkable day. In the years that followed, 5 children would grow up with an inexplicable affinity for bears, a fearlessness in the face of nature's challenges, and a profound ability to work together in times of crisis. They would never consciously remember the events of that day. They were simply too young for the memories to form in the conventional sense. But deep in their developing minds, the experience had left its mark, creating neural pathways of compassion, courage, and connection that would shape them throughout their lives. And in the forest, a mother bear would raise her cub with an unusual tolerance for the sounds of human children, sometimes pausing in her foraging when distant laughter reached her sensitive ears, her head tilting in recognition of a sound that once meant salvation rather than danger. 2 separate worlds, forever touched by one extraordinary moment when the barriers between them temporarily dissolved, revealing a truth as ancient as life itself, that in the face of crisis, compassion knows no species, courage knows no age, and miracles can come from the most unexpected sources, even from the tiny hands of children too young to know what they had done. 3 years passed since that extraordinary day on the mountainside. The story of the toddlers and the bear had become something of a local legend in the small mountain community of Pine Ridge. Parents recounted it during campfires, rangers used it in their wildlife safety presentations, and occasionally a news outlet would revisit the tale, often embellishing the details until fact and fiction blurred together like watercolors. Emma, now 5 years old with the same bouncing blonde curls but a newfound confidence in her stride, sat cross-legged on her kindergarten classroom's reading carpet. Today was show and tell, and she clutched a worn photograph in her small hands. When Miss Winters called her name, Emma walked to the front of the class with purpose. "This is my special picture," she announced, holding up the photograph that her father had taken just minutes after the bear incident. In it, 5 bewildered toddlers sat on a picnic blanket, their eyes wide with an experience too profound for their developing minds to fully process. Behind them, Ranger Chen could be seen speaking with the parents, gesturing toward the forest edge. "My daddy says we helped a mommy bear when I was little," Emma explained to her classmates, most of whom had heard versions of the story around town. "I don't remember it very good, but sometimes I dream about bears, and they're never scary." What Emma didn't tell her classmates, what she hadn't even told her parents, was that the dreams felt more like memories that grew clearer with each passing year. In them, she could feel the weight of berries in her overalls, could hear the desperate growls of the mother bear, could sense the inexplicable connection that had formed between 5 human babies and a wild creature in distress. Meanwhile, across town in Dr. Martinez's pediatric practice, Aiden sat on the examination table for his annual checkup. At 5.5, he was tall for his age, his curious brown eyes now accompanied by thoughtful questions that sometimes startled adults with their insight. "Any concerns about his development?" Dr. Martinez asked Sarah as she checked Aiden's reflexes. Sarah hesitated. "He's been drawing the same picture over and over," she finally said, pulling a folded paper from her purse. She opened it to reveal a child's drawing of a large brown shape hanging from a jagged line, with 5 small stick figures standing below it. "He says it's from his dreams." Dr. Martinez studied the drawing with interest. Like everyone else in Pine Ridge, she knew the bear rescue story. Many children process early experiences through artwork, even experiences they don't consciously remember, she explained gently. His brain is likely trying to make sense of what happened that day. What the doctor didn't mention was the remarkable symmetry in the drawing, the careful placement of each stick figure, and the surprising detail in the bear's expression. Elements well beyond the typical artistic abilities of a 5-year-old. Across town, the twins Zoe and Noah were having a very different experience at Pine Ridge Memory Gardens, the retirement community where their grandmother lived. The twins, now 8 years old, with matching gap-toothed smiles, had developed a special relationship with many of the elderly residents. Today, they were visiting Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, a 92-year-old former wildlife biologist who had specifically requested their company. "Tell me again about the bear," Mrs. Jenkins said, her arthritic hands gently holding her teacup. Though her body had weakened with age, her mind remained sharp, especially when it came to matters of wildlife behavior. The twins exchanged glances, their unique connection allowing them to communicate without words. "We don't really remember it, Mrs. Jenkins," Zoe explained politely. "We were only 2. But sometimes," Noah hesitated. "Sometimes what, dear?" the elderly woman prompted. "Sometimes we have the same dream on the same night," Noah admitted, about bears and cliffs and berry bushes. Mrs. Jenkins set down her teacup, her faded blue eyes suddenly intent. "Shared dreams between twins isn't unheard of," she said carefully, "but I'm more interested in whether you still feel it." "Feel what?" Zoe asked. "The connection," Mrs. Jenkins replied simply. "To each other, to nature, to whatever force allowed 5 toddlers to save a creature that should have instinctively terrified them." The twins fell silent, unsure how to explain to the elderly woman that yes, they did feel it, a pull toward the mountains that grew stronger as they aged, an uncanny ability to anticipate each other's thoughts, and a fearlessness around wild creatures that sometimes worried their parents. And what of baby Mia, the youngest of the 5 miracle children, as some in town had taken to calling them? Now, 4 years old, with wild curly hair and an even wilder spirit, Mia had developed a fascination with mud and clay that her artist mother had nurtured into a precocious talent for sculpture. Today, in the town's small art gallery where her mother worked, Mia's hands methodically shaped a lump of clay. "What are you making, sweetheart?" her mother asked, peering over her daughter's shoulder at the emerging form. "Bear and baby bear," Mia replied without looking up, her small fingers somehow capturing the protective curve of a mother bear's posture as she stood over her cub. The detail was remarkable, the proportions perfect, the texture of fur suggested with tiny fingerprint impressions in the clay. Her mother shivered slightly. Mia had never seen a real bear. Not since that day she couldn't possibly remember. Yet her sculptures always carried an authenticity that suggested otherwise. And what of Ranger Monica Chen? The incident had changed the trajectory of her career. Her field notes from that day, carefully worded to stick to observable facts, had nevertheless caught the attention of Dr. Samuel Richards, a renowned researcher studying animal-human interactions at the State University. Now, she sat across from him in his cluttered office, discussing the unexpected findings of their 3-year study. "The data is clear, Doctor," Richard said, gesturing to the charts displayed on his computer screen. "Bear populations in sectors adjacent to human settlements typically display avoidance behaviors consistent with fear responses. But this particular family group," he tapped a red circle on the map, "demonstrates neutral or even mildly positive responses to human proximity. It defies everything we know about ursine behavioral patterns." Monica nodded, thinking of the mother bear and her cub, now a gangly adolescent bear himself. Through radio collar tracking, camera traps, and careful observation, they had documented the bear's unusual tolerance for human activity. The mother bear would pause at certain sounds, particularly the laughter of children, her posture relaxing rather than tensing as would be expected. "Something fundamentally changed in her that day," Monica said quietly. "Some barrier was crossed that we don't have the scientific vocabulary to fully explain." What none of them knew, not the children with their dreams, not the parents with their concerns, not even Monica with her scientific observations, was that the story was about to take an even more extraordinary turn. It began with the weather. An unusually wet spring had saturated the mountains around Pine Ridge. Geologists had warned about the potential for landslides, but few had taken the warning seriously until the night when heavy rains triggered a catastrophic slope failure on the same mountainside where the bear rescue had occurred 3 years earlier. Emma awoke screaming in the middle of the night, her small body drenched in sweat. "The bears! The bears are scared!" she cried as her father rushed into her room. Before he could comfort her, his phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Mandatory evacuation for all residents in the Pine Ridge eastern sector due to landslide risk. Across town, the same scene played out in 4 other homes. Aidan stood pale-faced at his bedroom window, pointing wordlessly toward the mountains where distant trees could be seen, swaying and falling as the earth moved beneath them. The twins woke simultaneously in separate bedrooms, both reaching for their hiking boots before their parents had even received the evacuation notice. And Mia, clutching her clay bear sculpture, refused to leave the house until her mother promised they would check on the real bears. As families throughout Pine Ridge threw essential belongings into cars and headed for the designated evacuation centers, something unprecedented was happening in the mountains. The mother bear, now older and more massive than she had been 3 years ago, paced anxiously at the edge of her territory. Her adolescent cub, nearly full-grown himself, watched her with confusion as she growled and circled, her nose raised to the rain-heavy air. Then, as if coming to a decision that defied all natural instinct, the mother bear began moving directly toward the human settlement. Her cub hesitated before following, clearly uncertain about this deviation from their usual patterns. Behind them, the mountain continued to shift and groan as saturated soil gave way under the relentless rainfall. At the Pine Ridge Elementary School, which had been converted into an emergency shelter, chaos reigned as frightened families checked in and volunteers distributed blankets and supplies. Through the confusion moved 5 children who had never lost their connection to each other, despite attending different schools and living in different neighborhoods. Somehow, amidst the crowd, Emma, Aidan, the twins, and Mia found each other, gathering in a quiet corner of the gymnasium while their distracted parents dealt with the crisis. "You felt it too," Emma said. It wasn't a question. Aidan nodded solemnly. "The bears are trying to tell us something." "They're coming this way," Zoe added, while Noah nodded in confirmation. Mia clutched her clay sculpture, her eyes wide. "Bears need help," she said simply. Outside, the storm intensified. Rain lashed against the building's windows, and the distant rumble of moving earth sent tremors through the floor. Emergency officials moved efficiently through the crowd, assuring everyone that they were safe in this designated shelter, far from the landslide's projected path. Only Ranger Chen, who had arrived to assist with the evacuation efforts, noticed the 5 children slipping out a side door into the storm. By the time she fought her way through the crowd to follow them, they had already disappeared into the darkness. "The children from the bear incident," she explained urgently to the emergency coordinator. "They've gone outside. We need to find them immediately." A search team was hastily assembled, but the driving rain and howling wind made visibility nearly impossible. Flashlight beams cut ineffectively through the darkness as rangers and volunteers called out the children's names. What no one could see was that the children were already far from the school, moving with a sure-footed confidence that should have been impossible in such conditions. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Some invisible thread connected them, guiding their steps along a path none of them consciously remembered but all somehow knew. And they were not alone. At the edge of town, where the forest began its climb toward the mountains, the mother bear and her adolescent cub had emerged from the trees. They stood perfectly still, rain plastering their thick fur to powerful bodies, watching the distant lights of emergency vehicles with unusual calm. Then, as if sensing what was coming, the mother bear turned her gaze toward the approaching children. The moment the 2 groups saw each other should have been one of terror. Massive, wild predators face to face with small, vulnerable humans in the middle of a natural disaster. But instead, something miraculous happened. The 5 children stopped a respectful distance away, and Emma, still the natural leader, raised her small hand in a gesture eerily similar to the one she had made as a toddler. The mother bear dipped her massive head in acknowledgement, then turned and began walking along the edge of the forest, occasionally looking back as if to ensure the children were following. Her cub stayed close to her side, casting curious glances at the human youngsters who showed none of the fear that usually characterized encounters between their species. Behind them, the mountain groaned again, and a new surge of mud and debris cascaded down its flank. The bear led the children away from the danger, following an instinctive knowledge of stable ground. They moved in single file, 2 bears followed by 5 children, along a route that skirted the danger zone. Meanwhile, the search party had split into smaller groups, desperation mounting as the storm intensified, and there was still no sign of the missing children. Ranger Chen, drawing on her knowledge of the area, headed toward the forest edge, following nothing more than a hunch and her memory of what had happened 3 years ago. The beam of her flashlight caught a surprising sight: small footprints alongside massive paw prints in the mud, moving away from the landslide zone rather than toward it. "This way," she shouted to the others, but her voice was lost in the storm. Making a split-second decision, she followed the tracks alone, moving as quickly as the treacherous conditions would allow. The trail led her on a winding path that gradually climbed to higher ground, eventually bringing her to the entrance of a cave set into a stable rock formation well away from the landslide's path. There, in the shelter of the cave mouth, illuminated by a flash of lightning, stood 2 bears and 5 children, looking back at her with the same extraordinary calm they had shown each other. The mother bear made no threatening moves, simply watching as Monica slowly approached the children. "They knew," Emma said simply when Monica reached them, her voice filled with a wisdom beyond her years. "They knew the mountain was falling and where it was safe." "They remembered us," Aiden added, "just like we remembered them." Monica knelt beside the children, checking each for injuries, but finding only mud and rain. Behind them, deeper in the cave, she could make out more shapes, other forest animals that had sought shelter from both the storm and the landslide. Somehow, impossibly, the bears had created a safe haven and had specifically sought out the 5 children who had once saved them. "The mountain remembers too," Mia said cryptically, patting the stone floor of the cave with the same motion she had once used to pack mud around a crumbling cliff edge. Before Monica could respond, her radio crackled to life. Emergency services had regained enough signal to contact her. "Chen here," she responded. "I've found the children. They're safe. We've located a secure shelter away from the landslide path." She hesitated before adding, "You're not going to believe who helped me find them." As rescue teams eventually reached their location and the children were reunited with their frantic parents, the mother bear and her cub retreated deeper into the cave, maintaining a watchful but non-threatening presence. Wildlife officials arriving on the scene were baffled by the bear's behavior. By all known science, the wild animals should have either fled the humans or responded aggressively to protect their territory. Instead, they appeared to be waiting, watching, making sure everyone was safe. In the days that followed, as the storm subsided and the full extent of the landslide damage became clear, scientific teams descended on Pine Ridge to study both the geological event and the unprecedented animal behavior that had been reported. The cave, it turned out, sat on one of the only stable rock formations in the area, precisely the location that emergency management would have chosen for a shelter had they known of its existence. Somehow, the bears had known, and somehow they had specifically sought out 5 particular children to guide to safety. Dr. Richards arrived from the university, setting up cameras and observation blinds near the cave, which the mother bear and her cub continued to use as a temporary den. "We're witnessing something unprecedented in recorded scientific observation," he told Monica as they reviewed footage of the bears calmly coexisting in proximity to human recovery teams. "There's an established relationship here that defies our current understanding of interspecies dynamics." What no one could fully explain was the children's role in it all. Child psychologists were brought in to gently interview Emma, Aiden, the twins, and Mia about their experience, but the children's accounts contained elements that couldn't be neatly categorized or explained. They spoke of dreams that felt like memories, of knowing things they couldn't possibly know, of feeling a connection not just to the bears, but to the mountain itself. "The mountain remembers," Mia repeated, when asked why she hadn't been afraid of the bears during the storm. "And so do we." As Pine Ridge began the long process of recovery, the story of the bears and the 5 children spread far beyond the small mountain community. News crews arrived to report on the miracle children and their extraordinary bond with wild animals. Scientists debated the implications for our understanding of animal cognition and interspecies communication. Child development experts pondered the long-term effects of profound early experiences on developing minds. But perhaps the most significant development came 1 month after the landslide, when town officials gathered to discuss the creation of a new wildlife conservation area, encompassing the landslide zone and surrounding forest. The town hall meeting was filled beyond capacity, with residents spilling out into the parking lot, listening through open windows. At the front of the room sat 5 small chairs, occupied by Emma, Aiden, Zoe, Noah, and Mia. Though they were just children, their unexpected role in recent events had earned them a voice in the proceedings. Mayor Thompson, a practical woman not given to sentimentality, called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss the proposed Pine Ridge Wildlife Conservation Initiative," she began, her voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "Dr. Richards and Ranger Chen will present their recommendations, after which we'll open the floor for community input." Dr. Richards approached the podium, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the packed room. "What we've witnessed in Pine Ridge challenges our fundamental understanding of human-wildlife interactions," he began. "The behavioral patterns of the local bear population, particularly the mother bear and her offspring that have been central to these unusual events, suggest a level of cognitive complexity and interspecies recognition previously undocumented in scientific literature." He clicked through slides showing camera trap images of the mother bear and her now adolescent cub, pointing out behavioral anomalies that differentiated them from typical ursine patterns. "Most significantly," he continued, "these bears appear to have developed a specific recognition of and non-aggressive response to human children, particularly these 5 children." He gestured toward Emma, Aiden, and the others. Monica Chen spoke next, her ranger uniform crisp despite the long hours she'd been working since the landslide. "The proposed conservation area would create a buffer zone between human settlements and critical wildlife habitat," she explained, pointing to maps projected on the wall. "It would also protect the cave system that provided shelter during the recent disaster, which preliminary studies suggest may be part of a larger underground network with both ecological and potential emergency management significance." What no one had anticipated was the moment when Emma stood up from her small chair and walked to the front of the room. At 5 years old, she barely reached the microphone, but Mayor Thompson adjusted it without comment, a sign of the unusual respect these children had earned. "The bears are our friends," Emma said simply, her voice clear in the suddenly silent room. "They saved us because we saved them. They remember, and we remember, and the mountain remembers too." Aiden joined her next. "My mom says that when people save each other, they have a special connection forever," he added. "It's the same with bears." One by one, the twins and Mia also spoke, each adding their perspective with the straightforward wisdom that sometimes comes only from children. When they finished, the room remained silent for a long moment before erupting into emotional applause. The conservation initiative passed unanimously, but it was only the beginning of a more profound transformation in Pine Ridge. As weeks turned into months and the seasons changed, the town gradually became known for something beyond the extraordinary bear rescue story or the landslide miracle. It became a place where science and mystery coexisted, where humans and wildlife found new ways to share space. The 5 children, already bound by their shared experiences, grew closer as they began first grade together, with Mia in kindergarten being the youngest. Their teachers noted their unusual unity, the way they naturally collaborated on projects, and their exceptional empathy for both classmates and animals. During a fall field trip to the newly established conservation area, something unexpected happened. The class had gathered at an observation platform built at a safe distance from known wildlife corridors. Their teacher, Ms. Winters, was explaining the importance of respecting wild animals by maintaining appropriate distance when a hushed whisper spread through the group. At the edge of the clearing stood the mother bear and her adolescent cub, now nearly as large as she was. Rather than retreating into the forest at the sight of 20 children, the bears remained still, their attention focused specifically on 5 particular faces in the group. "Everyone stay very calm," Ms. Winters instructed, her voice tight with controlled concern. The other children pressed closer to her, but Emma, Aiden, the twins, and Mia stepped forward to the platform railing, their expressions serene. For a long moment, children and bears regarded each other across the clearing. Then, in a gesture that would be analyzed and debated by wildlife experts for years to come, the mother bear gently pushed her adolescent cub forward with her nose. The younger bear hesitated, then moved a few steps toward the platform before stopping again. "He wants to show us something," Zoe whispered to the others. Before Miss Winters could stop them, the 5 children had climbed down from the platform and were standing on the ground, maintaining what they somehow knew was a respectful distance from the bears. The rest of the class watched in astonishment as the adolescent bear turned and took a few steps into the forest, then looked back at the children as if expecting them to follow. Rangers were called immediately, and Monica Chen arrived to find an unprecedented scene. 2 wild bears waiting patiently at the forest edge while 5 children stood calmly nearby, seemingly communicating with the animals in some silent language no one else could understand. "They want to show us something," Emma repeated when Monica approached. "Something important." After much discussion, and with extraordinary precautions in place, including tranquilizer guns that Monica hoped she wouldn't need to use, a decision was made to follow the bears under controlled conditions. A team of researchers, rangers, and wildlife experts assembled, with the 5 children walking at the center of the protective group. The bears led them on a winding path deep into the forest, occasionally stopping to ensure their human followers were still behind them. After nearly an hour, they arrived at a small secluded valley untouched by the landslide. There, nestled among ancient trees, was a hidden spring bubbling up from the earth, and gathered around it was the most extraordinary assembly of wildlife any of the researchers had ever witnessed. Deer drank peacefully alongside raccoons. A family of foxes rested near a fallen log where several rabbits sat grooming themselves. Birds of various species perched on branches above, their usual territorial squabbles absent. And at the far edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows, stood a magnificent elk with massive antlers. "It's impossible, Doctor," Richards whispered, frantically taking photographs. "Predator and prey species don't coexist like this. This defies everything we know about wildlife behavior." The mother bear and her cub made their way to the spring, drank deeply, then settled on a patch of soft grass, apparently content to rest in the presence of animals that should have fled from them in terror. "The water," Monica said suddenly, kneeling to examine the spring more closely. "There's something unusual about it. She took samples in small vials, her ranger's training temporarily overshadowed by scientific curiosity. Analysis would later reveal that the spring contained a unique mineral composition found nowhere else in the region, compounds that seemed to have both medicinal properties and a calming effect on the nervous systems of various animal species. It was a discovery that would eventually lead to breakthroughs in both wildlife conservation and human medicine. But in that moment, what mattered most was the realization that the bears had deliberately chosen to share this secret place with the 5 children who had once saved them. That somehow, across the boundaries of species and language, a trust had formed that transcended scientific understanding. As the years passed, Pine Ridge transformed from a small mountain town known for a single miraculous event into a center for revolutionary research on wildlife behavior, interspecies communication, and the lasting impacts of early childhood experiences with nature. The 5 children grew into teenagers with an unbreakable bond and a shared purpose, protecting the delicate balance between human communities and the natural world. Emma, at 15, had become a gifted wildlife photographer whose images captured intimate moments of animal behavior rarely witnessed by humans. Aiden's scientific aptitude led him to develop new tracking technologies that minimize stress on the animals being studied. The twins created educational programs that brought children from across the country to learn about conservation, while Mia's artistic talents evolved into powerful visual advocacy for endangered species. The mother bear, now in the twilight of her life, continued to inhabit the protected forest around Pine Ridge with her grown offspring and, eventually, grandcubs. Camera traps occasionally captured footage of her sitting quietly at the edge of designated viewing areas, watching human visitors with a calm curiosity that still defied conventional wildlife behavior models. Scientists came from around the world to study what became known as the Pine Ridge phenomenon, the unusual coexistence of humans and wildlife in the region, the medicinal spring with its unique properties, and most intriguingly, the special connection between 5 particular young people and the bear family that had once been saved by them as toddlers. Not everyone believed the more extraordinary elements of the story. Skeptics dismissed the accounts of pre-verbal toddlers coordinating a bear rescue, or bears specifically seeking out 5 children during a natural disaster as embellishments or coincidences. But those who spent time in Pine Ridge, who witnessed the ongoing interactions between the now teenage miracle children and the local wildlife, often left with their skepticism shaken. On Emma's 16th birthday, her parents finally gave her the journal that Ranger Chen had kept during those early years. Monica had documented everything: the initial rescue, the dreams the children reported, the landslide evacuation, and countless smaller incidents that had occurred as the 5 grew up under the watchful eyes of both human researchers and wild animals. That evening, Emma gathered her 4 friends at their special place, a small cabin built specifically for them at the edge of the conservation area, where they conducted their own observations and projects. As they sat together reading Monica's detailed accounts, pieces of a puzzle they had been assembling their entire lives finally began to fit together. "She knew," Aiden said softly, pointing to an entry where Monica had written about witnessing Emma as a toddler throwing berries over the cliff edge. "She saw what was happening, even when no one else did." "Listen to this," Zoe added, reading aloud. "The conventional scientific framework provides no explanation for what I observed today. 5 children under the age of 3, with no verbal communication skills, no understanding of physics or animal behavior, somehow coordinated actions that saved a 400-pound wild predator from certain death. If I hadn't witnessed it myself, I would dismiss it as impossible." As they continued reading, night fell outside the cabin windows. In the darkness of the forest, unseen but ever present, animals moved quietly about their business, some hunting, some foraging, some simply watching the warm light that spilled from the cabin where 5 extraordinary teenagers sat surrounded by journals, photographs, and memories both conscious and unconscious. And deep within the forest, in a comfortable den lined with soft grasses, an elderly mother bear rested her gray-muzzled head on her paws. Her eyes remained open, gazing into the darkness, perhaps remembering a moment long ago when tiny hands had reached out to save her from a deadly fall. Perhaps wondering, in whatever way bears wonder, about the strange interconnectedness of all living things and the mysterious ways in which kindness ripples outward through time, crossing the boundaries between species, between words and wordlessness, between science and those things for which science has not yet found names. The mysteries of Pine Ridge would continue to unfold for many years to come. New generations of both humans and animals would enter the story, each adding their own chapter to a narrative that defied conventional categories. Research papers would be published, documentaries filmed, theories proposed and debated. But at its heart, it would always remain the story of 5 toddlers who somehow knew exactly what to do when a mother bear was falling from a cliff, and of the bears who remembered years later when those same children needed saving in return. A story of tiny hands and massive paws, of innocence and instinct, of memory deeper than words, of connections that transcend understanding. And perhaps most importantly, a story of the extraordinary things that can happen when the boundaries between worlds momentarily dissolve, revealing truths about ourselves and our place in the natural order that we are only beginning to comprehend. 20 years later, on a crisp autumn evening when the mountains wore their golden crown of falling leaves, an elderly woman made her way slowly along a familiar trail. Dr. Emma Marshall, now a world-renowned wildlife biologist specializing in interspecies communication, moved with purpose despite her cane. At 45, she still had the same bouncing blonde curls, though now streaked with dignified silver, and her eyes still held that mixture of curiosity and certainty that had defined her since childhood. Behind her walked her 4 lifelong friends, Dr. Aiden Chen, who had married Monica's daughter years ago, the twins Zoe and Noah Carter, who ran the Pine Ridge Conservation Institute, and Mia Edwards, whose wildlife sculptures now stood in museums around the world. Though their paths had taken them to different corners of the globe at times, they had always returned to Pine Ridge, to the forest that had shaped their extraordinary lives. "Do you think she'll come?" Mia asked softly, clutching a small clay sculpture, a replica of the one she had made as a child, now weathered with age. "She's very old," Aiden reminded them gently. "The tracking collar stopped transmitting 3 weeks ago." "She'll be there," Emma said with quiet confidence. "She knows." They continued in silence, following the trail that wound deeper into the forest, now protected as an international biosphere reserve. Pine Ridge had grown into a small city over the decades, but its unique relationship with the surrounding wilderness remained its defining feature. Children grew up learning to respect, rather than fear, wild creatures. Hikers knew to give wildlife space and dignity, and somewhere in these ancient woods, the descendants of a mother bear, who once nearly fell from a cliff, continued to display behaviors that still confounded conventional wildlife biology. As the 5 friends emerged into a familiar clearing, they saw the old observation platform where they had stood as children during that memorable field trip. Now, it was part of a larger research station, equipped with advanced technology for studying wildlife without disturbing them. But tonight, all the equipment was silent. The staff had been given the evening off. No cameras would record what happened here. In the center of the clearing, they arranged 5 small cushions in a circle and sat down, just as they had done countless times over the years. Emma placed a worn photograph in the center, 5 bewildered toddlers on a picnic blanket, a moment frozen in time that had altered the course of their lives. "It's been 40 years," Noah said quietly. 40 years since tiny hands saved a falling bear, Zoe added. They fell silent, letting the forest sounds envelop them, the whisper of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the soft rustling of creatures moving through underbrush. As darkness deepened, they lit a small lantern, its gentle glow creating a warm circle in the gathering night. "I finished the paper," Emma said after a while, reaching into her bag to withdraw a manuscript. The complete documentation of the Pine Ridge phenomenon, spanning 4 decades of research. Everything we've learned, everything we've observed, everything we've felt. "Will the scientific community accept it?" Aidan asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma smiled. "Parts of it, perhaps. The medicinal properties of the spring water, the unusual behavioral patterns in local wildlife, the statistical anomalies in conservation outcomes when children are involved in the process." She touched the manuscript gently. "But the heart of it, what happened to us, what continues to happen here, that will remain beyond the reach of conventional science for some time to come." "And that's as it should be," Mia said, setting her clay sculpture beside the photograph. "Some connections aren't meant to be reduced to data points." They shared stories as the night deepened, remembering moments from their extraordinary journey. The town meeting where they had first spoken publicly about their connection to the bears, the discovery of the hidden spring, the countless small miracles that had unfolded as they grew up under the watchful eyes of both human researchers and wild creatures. They spoke of Monica Chen, now passed away, but whose meticulous journals had provided the foundation for their life's work. As midnight approached, their conversation gradually quieted. Emma glanced toward the edge of the clearing, her expression softening. "She's here," she whispered. The others turned to look. There, barely visible in the darkness beyond the lantern's glow, stood an ancient bear. Her once glossy coat was now dull and patchy with age. Her muzzle had gone completely gray. She moved with the stiffness of very old animals, each step clearly an effort. "Great-grandmother Bear," Zoe murmured, using the name they had given her years ago when they realized she had lived long enough to see 3 generations of offspring. The elderly bear paused at the edge of the clearing, her rheumy eyes reflecting the lantern light. Behind her emerged several younger bears, her descendants, who had inherited her unusual tolerance for humans and her special connection to these 5 particular people. No one moved, no one spoke. In the silence of the forest night, human and bear regarded each other across a clearing filled with memories. Then, with tremendous effort, the ancient bear began moving forward. The younger bears stayed behind, watching attentively but making no move to interfere. Slowly, painfully, the mother bear, who had once almost fallen from a cliff, made her way into the circle of light. Emma rose first, then the others followed. They stood together as the old bear approached, stopping just a few feet away. For a long moment she simply looked at them, her gaze moving from one face to another, as if remembering each one. Then, with a soft grunt that might have been pain or might have been greeting, she lowered herself to the ground before them. Her breathing was labored, her great sides heaving with the effort of her journey. Understanding dawned on them all at once. The old bear had not come to visit. She had come to say goodbye. Emma knelt first, then Aidan, then the twins, and finally Mia. They formed a circle around the bear, close enough to touch but maintaining a respectful distance. No words were necessary between them, there never had been. Whatever connection had formed 40 years ago, when tiny hands reached out to save a falling bear, transcended language, transcended species, transcended understanding. The old bear's eyes began to close, then opened again with effort, as if she was fighting to remain present with them just a little longer. Emma, moved by an instinct deeper than thought, began to hum softly, a lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. The others joined in, their voices blending in the quiet night. Around them, the forest grew incredibly still, as if every creature for miles had paused to witness what was happening. The younger bears at the edge of the clearing sat watchfully, their usual wariness replaced by something like reverence. As the humans continued their gentle song, the old bear's breathing gradually slowed. Her eyes met Emma's one last time, ancient wild wisdom meeting human compassion in a gaze that contained 40 years of shared history. Then, with a soft sigh that seemed to carry both contentment and release, the great mother bear closed her eyes for the final time. Her massive body relaxed, her breathing stilled. The 5 friends continued their lullaby until they were certain she had passed. Then, in the profound silence that followed, each placed a hand gently on her cooling fur. A final connection, a final goodbye. Mia was the first to notice the soft blue glow that began to emanate from the bear's body. Not alarming or unnatural, but a gentle luminescence like moonlight on water. It spread outward, enveloping the humans in its cool radiance. Where it touched their skin, they felt not cold, but a profound sense of connection. To the bear, to the forest, to each other, to something ancient and knowing that flowed through all living things. The glow lasted only moments before fading, but in its wake, each of them felt changed in ways they couldn't articulate. Tears flowed freely down their faces, not just of grief, but of wonder, of gratitude, of understanding deeper than words could express. As dawn approached, they prepared to leave. The younger bears had maintained their vigil throughout the night, and now they came forward, moving with deliberate gentleness around the humans to nuzzle and sniff the body of their matriarch. There was a dignity in their movements, a consciousness of the significance of the moment that defied conventional understanding of animal cognition. The 5 friends gathered their belongings, knowing that rangers would come soon to ensure the bear's remains were treated with appropriate respect. As they turned to go, Emma paused to look back one last time at the clearing, where so much of their extraordinary story had unfolded. In that moment, in the first golden light of dawn, she thought she saw something, a shimmer in the air above the old bear's body. For just an instant, it seemed to take the form of a young, powerful bear, standing tall and strong as she had been 40 years ago, when tiny hands had reached out to save her from a deadly fall. The apparition, if that's what it was, seemed to meet Emma's gaze one final time before dissolving into the morning light like mist. "Goodbye, old friend," Emma whispered. "Thank you for everything you taught us." As they walked back along the trail, the forest around them seemed to pulse with life and awareness. Birds called from the trees. Squirrels paused on branches to watch them pass. A family of deer stepped unhurriedly across their path, showing none of the fear wild creatures usually display toward humans. They walked in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts and feelings, yet connected by a lifetime of shared experiences that had begun with an improbable rescue and culminated in this night of farewell. When they reached the edge of the forest where their paths would separate to their respective homes, they formed a circle, joining hands as they had done countless times over the decades. "What now?" Noah asked quietly. Emma looked at each of her lifelong friends, these extraordinary people with whom she had shared a journey beyond imagination. "Now," she said, "we continue. We share what we've learned, not just the science, but the wonder. We teach the next generation that the boundaries between worlds are more permeable than they appear. we remember that a single act of compassion, even from the smallest hands, can ripple outward through lifetimes. As they embraced and prepared to part ways for the day, a soft breeze stirred through the trees behind them. For a moment it seemed to carry a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something in between. A farewell, perhaps, or a promise. 5 lives forever changed by an encounter too extraordinary for words. One bear who had defied every expectation of her species, and between them, a connection that had transcended the boundaries of what humans believed possible. In the years that followed, as the story of Pine Ridge continued to unfold with new generations of both humans and animals, that connection remained, a living testament to the truth that in a world often defined by separation and difference, love and compassion can build bridges between the most unlikely worlds. And sometimes, in rare and precious moments when we reach beyond our limitations to help another living being, we touch something profound and eternal that changes us forever. In the end, it wasn't just a story about a bear saved by babies or babies saved by a bear. It was a story about the miracle of connection itself. And like all true stories, it never really ended. It just continued to grow, to transform, to inspire, as enduring as the ancient mountains, as alive as the forest, as real as the bond between a falling bear and the tiny hands that reached out to save her.